Hey folks, welcome to a special solo episode of Ticket Stubz. My name is Tristan Moore, and if you're a regular Hard Ticket listener, you're used to hearing my voice paired with someone else. This Ticket Stubz episode was to be the first solo and scripted episode of the show, but my co-host Jeff beat me to the punch by a couple weeks with his thoughtful and sober Inside Gaza episode. Everyone should give it a listen. Anyway, we hope you enjoy this break from our regularly scheduled programming with our second solo scripted episode analyzing the themes of fate and free will in the Star Wars saga.
Somewhere in space, this may all be happening right now. 20th Century Fox and George Lucas, the man who brought you American Graffiti, now bring you an adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
If you've listened to Hard Ticket, there's a good chance you've listened to an episode we released in December 2025 called Revenge of the Jedi. This episode matched up 2005's Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith against 2017 Star Wars Episode 8 The Last Jedi. The matchup served a few purposes. One, it allowed us to invite Star Wars aficionado Joey Sullivan onto the program, which made for a fun and lively discussion. Two, it gave me an opportunity to defend The Last Jedi, a film I feel has been unfairly maligned since its release. And three, I think about Star Wars a lot. Probably more than the average person. And having my own podcast, I was looking for a chance to talk about something that has been a part of my identity since I was a little boy. So this is an essay about Star Wars to celebrate the 49th anniversary of the original film and to align with the release of the latest one. More specifically, and in the spirit of Hard Ticket, this is an intertextual analysis across the entire mainline Star Wars saga. That's episodes 1 all the way up to episode 9. Today, I'd like to talk about how fate and free will manifest across this series. And again, to be specific, how these themes manifest separately in the 3 distinct trilogies of the Star Wars saga. That is, the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, and the sequel trilogy. Let's dive in.
It is your destiny.
It was said that you would destroy the Sith, not join them!
You failed him by thinking his choice was made. It wasn't.
Fate and free will both play an important role in the Star Wars saga. If we go all the way back to 1977, back when Episode 4 A New Hope was still just called Star Wars, we're introduced to a lowly farm boy on the planet of Tatooine. His name is Luke Skywalker. By a twist of fate, a droid carrying the last hope of the rebellion, the plans to the Death Star, shows up in his backyard. When offered the chance to go on a journey to rescue Princess Leia and escort the plans to the rebellion, Luke initially declines what scholar Joseph Campbell referred to as the call to adventure. Joseph Campbell believed in a framework called the hero's journey, which describes a common template of a hero venturing forth from the world of the familiar into a supernatural world of wonders and turmoil. There, the hero is aided by mentors and helpers as they undergo a spiritual transformation. The hero eventually achieves a decisive victory and returns home to bestow so-called boons onto their fellow human. This is some sort of revelation or elixir, a hard-won blessing from their adventure. Star Wars creator George Lucas is candid about the influence Joseph Campbell's hero's journey template had on the inception of Star Wars. Campbell proposed that his formulation of the hero's journey had precedent throughout nearly every culture in recorded history. Therefore, if we think about Luke's initial rejection of the call to adventure, this beat was on some level written before George Lucas was even born, which actually muddies the line between Luke's apparent will as a protagonist and the necessity of Lucas to hew so close to a tried and true template, but that's probably a line of thinking for another day. Back to the movie. Luke finally accepts the call to adventure after his aunt and uncle are massacred by the Empire. It's a complicated moment. Luke is clearly shaken by the carnage he witnesses, and yet when we are introduced to him, we understand that he yearns for excitement and something new. The death of his aunt and uncle unburdens Luke of his pastoral responsibilities, and he returns to Obi-Wan to finally accept the call. As the original trilogy progresses, we come to understand Luke Skywalker as an active agent in his own adventure. He chooses to journey with Obi-Wan, he chooses to fight the Empire, and he chooses to train to become a Jedi. And Luke cites his father as his main source of inspiration.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
Why wish you become Jedi?
Mostly because of my father, I guess.
Of course, the monumental shift at the center of the original trilogy is the revelation that Darth Vader, the specter haunting Luke since he began his journey, the man alleged to have killed his father, is actually his father, Anakin Skywalker. Joseph Campbell would refer to this twist, possibly the greatest and certainly the most famous in film history, as the Abyss. No! The Abyss is the point of death and rebirth. Fittingly, when Luke learns of Vader's true identity in The Empire Strikes Back, he dangles over the yawning chasm of Cloud City and consciously lets go. You have to think about that moment this way. On a fundamental level, Anakin Skywalker is Luke Skywalker's reason for being. At the very least, he is Luke's central motivation for embarking on the hero's journey. Anakin Skywalker, a so-called good friend and powerful Jedi, is something for Luke to aspire to. When Anakin is unmasked as Darth Vader, Luke's worldview is shattered to its core. There are several ways to interpret Luke rejecting Vader's offer to rule the galaxy and jumping into the Abyss. To me, it reads as Luke giving up on his very existence. In his darkest hour, Luke Skywalker loses hope and chooses death. He chooses death. To the last, Luke is an active agent. Miraculously, Luke survives his plummet and is reborn. On board the Millennium Falcon, Luke calls out to his mentor Ben Kenobi.
Man, why didn't you tell me?
In this scene, we get a sense that things aren't what they seem, and that Luke may be manipulated by forces beyond his reckoning. In the finale to the original trilogy, Luke confronts his mentors Obi-Wan and Yoda and tells them he cannot kill his own father. Luke rejects the worldview of his old masters, who insist that if Luke cannot defeat Vader, all hope is lost and the Emperor has already won.
He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil.
As the film progresses, we learn that Luke believes that there is still good in the man who was once Anakin Skywalker. This is an essential tenet of Luke's rebirth from the abyss of Cloud City, that if he is to go on, then Anakin Skywalker, the man, must still exist as well. Luke appears confident of this idea throughout the latter half of Return of the Jedi. I'll suggest that this is less a form of confidence than it is a sort of fatalism that Luke has embraced. There is good in Anakin Skywalker, and if Luke is wrong, it's not a world he wants to live in anyway. If he is wrong, his father will strike him down. It's a sort of gambit built on faith and love and a boy's idealization of his father. This all culminates with a clash in the throne room of the Emperor. Throughout the duel, Luke is on the defensive, staving his father's strikes off and trying to stoke the good in him. Again and again, Vader comes after Luke, trying to goad him into fighting back. He is unsuccessful until he threatens Luke's sister, at which point Luke lashes out and comes within an inch of killing his own father.
So, you have a twin sister. Your feelings have now betrayed her too. Obi-Wan was wise to hide her from me. Now his failure is complete. If you will not turn to the dark side, then perhaps she will.
Crucially, Luke pulls back, and the culmination of his arc in the original trilogy, and the ultimate statement of his faith in his father, is his subsequent tossing away of his lightsaber. A choice to believe that his father will choose to do the right thing.
You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
Now Luke puts himself between his father and the man who has manipulated him into doing evil, the Emperor himself. Luke chooses to face the ire of the Emperor to force his father into a choice, either save Luke or let the Emperor kill him. In this way, Luke empowers Vader with the boon of agency, the ability to cast off his shackles and save the one he loves. Vader chooses love. He chooses life for his son. At the end of the film, Luke pays homage to his father and celebrates with the rest of the freed galaxy. Having liberated his father, Luke's spirit is likewise freed, and the galaxy is released from the grasp of tyranny. It's worth noting that Luke is on some level a stand-in for the creator George Lucas. Lucas had a reputation as a maverick creative who marched at the beat of his own drum. The freedom to make the movies he wanted was a goal Lucas strived for constantly. And through Star Wars, Lucas was given unprecedented freedom on that scale of filmmaking, a scale of filmmaking he gave new life to with his original trilogy. And so the original trilogy is on some level a celebration of free will and choice, the freedom of its creator and its main character and his friends, and even Darth Vader. Much of that freedom was owed to Star Wars being a blank slate. And even though it was a remix of the familiar, samurai films, old westerns, World War II dramas, Flash Gordon serials, and the Campbellian monomyth, it was also unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Its twists and turns meant that the original trilogy could end any number of ways. In fact, Lucas even toyed with alternate endings, both dramatically and tonally, like Luke turning to the dark side or leaving without celebrating with his friends. After the original trilogy, Star Wars would never truly be a blank slate again. After George Lucas completed the original trilogy, rumors about the future of the saga circulated for years. By this point, Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi had been assigned their respective episode numbers, indicating that a prequel trilogy was in the pipeline. As it turned out, 16 years after the conclusion of Luke's story, Anakin's would begin in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
I'm a person, and my name is Anakin.
On some level, the answer to how to follow up the original trilogy and Luke's arc was an obvious one. The prequel trilogy has a foregone conclusion written in 1977. It's called Star Wars. It was always going to end one way, unlike the open-ended nature of the original trilogy. George Lucas leaned into this narrative cul-de-sac by introducing, up front, a world manipulated in the shadows by a master puppeteer, the titular Phantom Menace. Parallel to the machinations of Senator-turned-Chancellor Palpatine, the young boy Anakin Skywalker is identified by Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn as the prophesied chosen one of Jedi legend.
You refer to the prophecy of the one who will bring balance to the Force. You believe it's this boy?
Right off the bat, we're dealing with a different kind of Star Wars. The prequel trilogy is not one defined by choice, freedom, and agency, but by fate, destiny, and manipulation. By embarking on his long-awaited prequel trilogy, Lucas actually leaned into the metatextual constraints of a prequel story by having his protagonist struggle in vain against the tragedy of his own life. We know it's in vain because the character of Darth Vader actually prefigures Anakin Skywalker. Consequently, Anakin is a very different sort of protagonist than Luke. When we meet him, he is only 9 years old, 10 years younger than Luke in the original Star Wars. Anakin's whole life is ahead of him, and Lucas makes a point of depicting Anakin in a strong, loving relationship with his mother, Shmi, who bore him miraculously without a father. Lucas draws a parallel here between Anakin Skywalker and Jesus Christ. In fact, Star Wars and Episode 1 in particular is chock full of religious imagery, most evident in Darth Maul's devil-like design. No one chooses to be pregnant. It's technically an involuntary process, but that's doubly so for Shmi Skywalker, who apparently conceived Anakin without any, input from a father. So Anakin's very foundation is one beyond the control of his own mother. The Force, always functioning as a deus ex machina, works in mysterious ways.
Who was his father?
There was no father. I carried him, I gave birth, I raised him. I can't explain what happened.
Qui-Gon Jinn forms a close relationship with Anakin's mother, and the two take on a quasi-parental role during the film's middle act on Tatooine. Qui-Gon believes in the prophesied power of Anakin Skywalker to the point where he manipulates a game of chance to bargain for his release from slavery. We watch as Anakin's fate is gambled before our very eyes. Now, going back to Anakin's age and his bond with his mother, when Anakin is finally freed from slavery and Qui-Gon offers to take him back to Coruscant to be trained as a Jedi, Anakin is faced with a difficult choice. This would seem to contradict the themes of fate and destiny Lucas has been setting up, but I believe this is deliberate, and we are meant to truly consider Anakin's position here. We are told that most Jedi begin training when they are too young to remember being taken from their parents. On the flip side, we know of Luke, a young man of 19 when he was able to make an informed decision about his own future.
Are you sure about this? Trusting our fate to a boy we hardly know? The Queen will not approve.
Anakin, on the other hand, is a 9-year-old boy. He's too old to be given away and to forget his parents, but too young to truly be able to make this decision for himself. When he is on some level torn from his mother, he incurs a psychic scar, a scar other Jedi never incur, and one that Luke, who actually never knew his biological parents, actually mines inspiration from, aspiring to be like the father he imagines Anakin was. Given the option to choose his fate, Anakin is put in a position where he wounds himself deeply. It's a wound that sets him up for failure later down the line.
I don't want things to change.
But you can't stop the change, any more than you can stop the suns from setting.
By the end of the film, Qui-Gon Jinn, Anakin's surrogate father, dies. In his place, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke's future mentor, agrees to train Anakin. It is Qui-Gon's dying wish to his pupil, a sort of obligation. Where Qui-Gon was warm and fatherly with Anakin, Obi-Wan is clearly not ready to train the boy. They are too similar in age, and Obi-Wan is stern and orthodox. Anakin passing into the care of Obi-Wan is always marred as a promise Obi-Wan made to his dying mentor, who basically thrust the boy into his arms. It's another psychic scar. The Jedi Council is wary of training Anakin because of his age, but it ultimately acquiesces. Maybe because the Jedi believe they can use Anakin's power in accordance with a prophecy we do not understand or are much privy to. We are told that it foretells of one who will bring balance to the Force and defeat the Sith. With the reemergence of the Sith in the form of Darth Maul, it seems the Council is eager to get ahead of this threat by enrolling the so-called Chosen One in its ranks.
Agree with you, the Council does. Your apprentice, Skywalker, will be.
Meanwhile, Anakin befriends newly appointed Chancellor Palpatine, who has manipulated a political crisis to become the leader of the Republic. With this complex web of relationships, we get a sense of Anakin as a boy-turned-teenager-turned-man who has been and is assaulted on all sides by those wishing to use him for their own personal means.
I see you becoming the greatest of all Jedi, Anakin. Even more powerful than Master Yoda.
In the midst of this, Anakin falls in love with Padme Amidala, a galactic senator who can no sooner disclose the nature of her relationship than Anakin can. Once more, these two are constrained by the boundaries of duty and to the systems they pledge loyalty to. George Lucas leans into the star-crossed lovers trope. Indeed, their main love theme, composed by John Williams, is called Across the Stars, to further sow tragedy in Anakin's story. Theirs is a love which can never be, for everything would come undone if it were exposed. And Anakin's earlier loss of his mother, formalized in Attack of the Clones when Shmi is kidnapped and killed by Tusken Raiders, is played on to make Anakin dangerously possessive of Padme. Anakin loses his mother after suffering visions of her dying. Soon after, he begins dreaming that Padme will die in childbirth. Are these dreams fated to happen, or can they be prevented? Palpatine, serving a grandfatherly role in Anakin's life, capitalizes on the insecurity Anakin feels by promising Anakin he can save Padme from the certainty of death. Anakin, whose living memory has been defined by hardship, loss, and the great expectations of others foisted upon him, gives in to Palpatine's manipulations with the understanding that fate can be subverted, that Padme can be saved.
To cheat death is a power only one has achieved. But if we work together, I know we can discover the secret.
In an act of dramatic irony, Anakin is ultimately responsible for killing his own lover. In doing so, he burns away the last remnants of his own humanity. It's a choice he makes because he feels he has no alternative. Once more, the forces of fate seemingly conspire against the tragic hero. All that's left is a puppet loyal to its puppeteer. It's an ending everyone familiar with the original trilogy already saw coming, and Anakin has to become Darth Vader. It is his destiny. And so George Lucas integrates that fatalism into his script for the prequel trilogy. It's no secret that the prequel trilogy was heavily criticized in its day. There are a variety of reasons for this, and one's own feelings about the trilogy will dictate whether those reasons were valid or not. But surely some of the disillusionment must have stemmed from the trilogy's fatalism, its sense of plotting toward the inevitable. It is spiritually opposed to the original trilogy. Here the Force is plotting against Anakin rather than empowering him as it did Luke. This was simply not the Star Wars that longtime fans knew, despite being a story everyone more or less knew was going to turn out the way it did. And maybe because of that, everyone had their own expectations about what it would be. Where it deviated, George Lucas erred. Lucas must have been aware of the pitfalls of writing a prequel, of telling a story his audience, his fervent, fanatical audience, already thought they knew. If Luke was a stand-in for Lucas in the original trilogy, the tragic downfall of Anakin Skywalker mirrors the perceptions fans had of Lucas where his prequel trilogy was coming out. And Lucas must have sympathized with his volatile protagonist, just trying to navigate through a world while being pulled in all different directions. Lucas would go on to tell stories set in his prequel trilogy for nearly a decade after Revenge of the Sith. Eventually, it seems like he'd had enough of the abuse from older fans. When asked in 2012 if he would make more Star Wars movies, Lucas said, "Why would I make any more when everybody yells at you all the time and says what a terrible person you are?" In 2012, George Lucas sold Star Wars to the Walt Disney Company. Upon sale of the IP, Disney committed to releasing Episode 7 by 2015. There would be more Star Wars with or without George Lucas, and now it had a choice to make. George Lucas, for better or worse, had always steered the creative direction of Star Wars. Still, films are a collaborative medium, and Lucas worked with many collaborators, including the likes of Kathleen Kennedy and Lawrence Kasdan, who would play integral creative roles in the new regime. Nevertheless, for 35 years, Lucas remained the ultimate arbiter of the IP. The buck stopped at George. That all changed when Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney, which pledged to release a sequel trilogy without the involvement of the IP's originator. Star Wars is a series in large part about absent fathers, so perhaps it was appropriate that one day the saga itself would be cast adrift without its founding figure. Kathleen Kennedy was appointed by Lucas himself to lead Lucasfilm, the production company behind Star Wars, but Kennedy seemingly favored a laissez-faire creative approach to the upcoming sequel trilogy. After some rough waters with screenwriter Michael Arndt, J.J. Abrams and Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi screenwriter Lawrence Kasdan were tapped on the shoulder to deliver Episode 7 by the end of 2015.
Chewie, we're home.
And deliver it, they did. Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens set the world ablaze, quickly becoming the highest-grossing domestic film of all time, a record it still holds over a decade later. It was wildly popular with fans and critics who appreciated its safe and familiar approach, at least initially. As the fervor died down, a common critique of the film became its recycled plot. It's like we'd all seen this before somehow, and in some uncanny way, the film was very much aware of this. For the first time since 1983, Star Wars had a chance to do something narratively that truly surprised audiences after the prequels had been a story leading to a foregone conclusion. And maybe bafflingly, The Force Awakens is a film that follows a very similar structure to the original Star Wars. It was as though the filmmakers chose to lean into this fatalistic idea of the past repeating itself. How does this creative approach manifest in the film's main character, Rey? Rey feels like a medley of Luke and Anakin Skywalker. Like them both, she grows up on a desert planet and yearns for adventure. She's mechanically inclined and supernaturally gifted like Anakin. And like Luke, she is a good person who does not really remember her parents or what her purpose is. Where Rey differs is at first evidenced by her immediate surroundings. Rey has grown up in the wreckage of the original trilogy, literally scavenging for parts to make a living. She has Star Wars action figures and cosplays in an X-Wing pilot's helmet. She believes Luke Skywalker is a myth. His story is just too fantastical for her.
Luke Skywalker? I thought he was a myth.
When Rey is swept up in an adventure in a similar way to Luke, by encountering a droid with an important message to deliver, her driving motivation is clear. All she wants is to go back to Jakku, her home world. She cannot accept that she might have been abandoned by her parents, so she longs to return to her hovel to await the return and receive some sort of explanation for why she was abandoned. Some sort of reason that will justify her pain and hardship, like Luke was given above the abyss on Cloud City.
I know all about waiting.
For my family. They'll be back. One day.
Rey, like Anakin, is really only superficially given the choice to embark on her adventure. She's quite literally pulled into the story by Finn and BB-8, who are being pursued by the First Order.
Stop taking my hand!
When she encounters the lightsaber that used to belong to Luke and Anakin, she rejects its call to adventure until almost the very end of the film. The Skywalker saber functions as Excalibur in this scene, and in a rousing moment, she pulls it from the snow and wields it against Kylo Ren, her dramatic foil for the trilogy.
That lightsaber, it belongs to me.
What's worthy about this moment is in the next sequence. Rey encounters Luke Skywalker, this figure from legends she heard of as a child, and tries to pass off the saber to him. This is how the film ends, essentially with Rey in the same place she started at, unwilling and thinking herself unworthy of wielding this lightsaber and taking up agency in her own story. We're treading water here. Star Wars is spinning its wheels in the mud.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
In my opinion, though, Rey's hesitance is easy to understand. Despite her outward confidence, Rey feels insecure because she has suddenly found herself dropped into the middle of an intergenerational family drama. Her mentor is Han Solo, her arch-nemesis Kylo Ren, son of Han and Leia, nephew of Luke Skywalker, and grandson of Darth Vader himself. With Rey's own origins shrouded in mystery, a mystery that she projects as a coping mechanism, she must wonder if her place in the story can be explained by a hidden bloodline she's not privy to.
Where do you come from? Classified, really? Me too. Big secret.
And it's the same thing the audience is wondering, particularly those who watched these movies as they came out. Star Wars fans, because of their intimate familiarity with the subject matter and its tropes, watched a familiar movie in The Force Awakens and expected a familiar twist with Rey, that she would be Luke's daughter, or Obi-Wan's daughter, or Shmi Skywalker's clone, or Palpatine's granddaughter. Imagine if that happened. Where it's easy to see where Luke and Anakin might have embodied aspects of George Lucas at different phases in his life, Rey then becomes a true audience surrogate for your average Star Wars fan and their relationship to the series. When you look at her character, she's basically an in-universe fangirl. She knows the rules of this universe, she worships the legend of Luke Skywalker, and she has internalized the beats of the original trilogy in much the same way the average Star Wars fan has, as foundational text around which to live her life. She expects to be related to someone important because we expect the same for her. When she knows who that someone is, she'll be ready to begin her journey, like Luke before her. Cast adrift without George Lucas steering the ship, we are now watching a Star Wars trilogy steered by its audience, steered by past tropes. So, fate versus free will. The Force Awakens, by so strongly mirroring the plot of A New Hope, begs the question, where are we all going with this? Is this just going to be the original trilogy again? Is it destined to be so? Or will we choose a new path?
Let the past die. Kill it, if you have to.
Probably unintentionally, The Force Awakens perfectly primes its sequel writer and director to dig into these questions. Indie director Rian Johnson would be tasked with delivering Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi to the world in 2017, and the world had a lot to say about it. Johnson is famously a storyteller who enjoys playing with genre tropes. Brick is a reimagining of the noir, Looper of the time travel story, the Knives Out movies of the murder mystery, etc. And Johnson's creative predecessor, J.J. Abrams, had delivered such a familiar Episode 7 that Johnson's follow-up had fertile ground to begin excavating these well-worn tropes and deciding which ones were worth adhering to. Right off the bat, the Luke Skywalker we're introduced to in The Last Jedi is not the one people expected, and was one a sizable chunk of the audience wasn't happy with. It was a Luke Skywalker who had lost his mojo.
I will never train another generation of Jedi. I came to this island to die. It's time for the Jedi to end.
I'll contend that after The Force Awakens established that Luke blamed himself for his Jedi Academy failing and exiled himself from the wider galaxy, a disillusioned Luke Skywalker was about the only direction The Last Jedi could take the character, but I digress. If we're to understand Luke as a surrogate of the creator George Lucas, then we can also understand him as a stand-in for Star Wars itself. This is a film asking, what is Star Wars going to be without George Lucas? Are we going to replay the hits forever, or are we going to be brave enough to forge a new path? It's a worthy question. What's the point of soldiering on if we can't do something new? And so the film wrestles with our sense of expectation. There are many twists and turns in The Last Jedi. Luke is demoralized for much of the film. Poe's harebrained scheme to get the First Order off the Resistance's back fails. Kylo Ren assassinates his master in the second act of this trilogy instead of the third. And Rey learns the truth about her parents.
They were nobody.
They were filthy junk traders who sold you off for drinking money. The dead in a pauper's grave in the Jakku Desert. You have no place in this story. You come from nothing. You're nothing. But not to me. Join me.
Rey was not destined to be in this story. It's important to stress what a radical departure this is from the Star Wars formula and how vital this was for the sequel trilogy. While everyone theorized about Rey being a clone or a distant relative of a legacy character, Rian Johnson understood that the only way Rey ends up being meaningful to the longevity of this series is if her origin is meaningless and random. Rey was not destined to be in this story. She defines herself by choosing to be in it, because she is a good person, because she is a competent person, because she is powerful, a power that she was destined to possess.
Darkness rises and light to meet it. I warned my young apprentice that as he grew stronger, his equal in the light would rise. Skywalker, I assumed. Wrongly.
Likewise, her dramatic foil, Kylo Ren, struggles with his place in the sequels. On paper, he has a privileged and cushy upbringing, yet he still turned evil. Except, he's not fully evil, is he?
Forgive me. I feel it again. The pull to the light. Supreme Leader senses it. Show me again the power of the darkness, and I will let nothing stand in our way. Show me, Grandfather, and I will finish what you started.
Kylo begs the mask of Darth Vader, his grandfather, this object of manipulation from the prequels onward, to literally fill him with a sense of responsibility to carry out this robot man's unfinished business. And Kylo Ren actually surpasses his grandfather's misdeeds in The Last Jedi when he murders Snoke and then chooses to ascend the throne. Where Snoke saw in Kylo Ren the promise of a new Vader, Kylo actually made good on that promise and killed his master as Vader killed the Emperor. Kylo's a victim of his own success because his nihilistic tirade against the traditions of old actually turns the one person he cares about against him.
It's time to let old things die. Snoke, Skywalker, the Sith, the Jedi, the Rebels, let it all die.
Kylo's actually espousing a similar worldview to Luke in The Last Jedi when he calls for the past to die. Like Kylo, Luke is determined to see the Jedi pass into antiquity in order to put an end to the cycle of history the sequel trilogy exists in. But The Last Jedi is not a nihilistic film, and the thesis of the film is not to let the past die. It sees the good in the past and tradition while also acknowledging the need to move on to new frontiers. Where The Force Awakens is something of a thesis statement for the sequel trilogy, a thesis that says, hey, we love Star Wars, look at all these Star Wars things. A big chunk of The Last Jedi toys with the antithesis. What? Did you think Luke Skywalker was going to pick up a laser sword and face down the entire First Order? Did you think the Rebels' harebrained schemes were going to work, really? Before settling firmly on a complementary synthesis. Okay, Luke is going to face down the entire First Order with a laser sword, but it's not going to go the way you think. And the good guys are going to escape, and the bad guys are going to get their comeuppance, and so on and so forth. Also, Rey's not related to anybody important, but that's okay, because she's accepted her place in this story. The ending of The Last Jedi is a blend of accepting the freedom of the original trilogy while acknowledging the importance of the steps that have led to this new era of Star Wars not charted by George Lucas. It's why the film, for all its subversions, plays out, on paper like a slightly tweaked Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Something new packaged in the familiar. And change is hard, and the fans prefer it piecemeal if done at all. The film's conclusion sees fate and free will coexist for the first time in the saga, and it feels like an open door to a boundless horizon. Where will things go in Episode 9? Will Hux turn the First Order against Kylo Ren? Will Finn lead a Stormtrooper rebellion? What kind of leader will Poe be? What will Rey learn from the Jedi texts, and how will she adapt the teachings of the Jedi in this new era? Will Rey and Kylo Ren finally get it on? How will the galaxy react to the news of Luke Skywalker's amazing show of the Force on Crate? And what new characters and worlds will we see?
How do we build a rebellion from this?
We have everything we need.
Of course, by now, Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker is legendary? Where The Last Jedi was able to synthesize the conservative fatalism of The Force Awakens with the radicalism of its own creative choices, Episode 9 demanded a writer-director in touch with that vein of storytelling. Unfortunately, J.J. Abrams was tapped on the shoulder to conclude the trilogy he'd written the thesis on, while completely ignoring the radical antithesis and interesting synthesis that had been pinned in his absence.
We've decoded the intel from the First Order spy, and it confirms the worst. Somehow Palpatine returned.
The result is a film that plays much like a revamped Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi without the interesting deviations Johnson was able to suffuse in The Last Jedi. Rey is gifted an important heritage that gives her a fated place in the story. Kylo Ren is stripped of much of his agency by being reduced to a stooge of the resurrected Emperor Palpatine, and Luke's sacrifice on Crate is never even mentioned, despite the ending of The Last Jedi showing that it spread the legend of Luke Skywalker far and wide. In the tug-of-war between fate and free will in the sequel trilogy, The Rise of Skywalker veers firmly into the predestination of things. The past repeats itself shamelessly and without variation, and, what's worse, by resurrecting the fallen Emperor and then killing him off again in essentially the same way he died in Return of the Jedi, how can we ever be sure that he won't return again somewhere down the line? The answer is, we can't, and Star Wars might be permanently busted.
Do not fear their feeble attack, my faithful. Nothing will stop the return of the Sith!
Okay, deep breath. I realize here at the end my mask of objectivity has completely slipped. I'll point out that Abrams' approach is not, objectively terrible, nor is it an invalid way to continue telling Star Wars stories. I mean, in fact, there's something to be said about The Force Awakens dealing with a resurgent fascist group catching the galaxy off guard after it was thought to have been dealt with. I mean, a wrinkly old bastard returning to another term after we thought we'd seen the last of him. I think that resonates with some political realities we're facing today.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
But mostly, I just find the approach redundant and stifling. If we can only do what's been done before, if our stories are predestined before we even write them, if they're only going to be reiterations of what we're so familiar with, what's even the point? It's tough to gauge the future of Star Wars in 2026. This episode will be released a few days after the release of the first Star Wars movie since The Rise of Skywalker. The Mandalorian and Grogu looks to be a mildly diverting side story about a familiar duo encountering familiar characters from other Star Wars TV shows. Maybe these small-scale stories are what we need as the dust continues to settle post-sequel trilogy, or maybe this endless cycle of self-reference will be like the snake eating its own tail. And that's a problem broader entertainment must contend with, not just this particular series. Interesting Star Wars stories have been told since The Rise of Skywalker. Andor functions in the same vein as the prequel trilogy, and Abrams' work for that matter, as a story told with a foregone conclusion. We know from Rogue One where Cassian Andor's story comes to an end, and yet Andor works its titular character into a sort of inversion of Luke Skywalker, in much the same way Anakin was. It does so in complex, mature ways that prove how these Star Wars stories are told can be just as crucial as what stories they're telling. Andor proves that there are still novel ways to fill the gaps in our Star Wars stories, ways that expand our imagination rather than limit it. But still, I wonder if all we're doing at this point is walling ourselves up brick by brick, a slow death by immurement as Star Wars seals itself in and refuses to move on in a meaningful way. All I know is that whenever future episodes 10, 11, and 12 are released, they must be radical to justify their existence. They must find a synthesis of fate and free will to truly resonate. For now, in my own head, the ending of the Skywalker saga is a young boy hearing the legend of Luke Skywalker, grabbing up room and gazing up at the stars in amazement.
Heeded my words not, did you? Pass on what you have learned. Strength, mastery, but weakness, folly, failure also. Yes, failure most of all. The greatest teacher, failure is. Luke, we are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of Ticket Stubz. Thank you, Jared Tadlock, for keeping our brand fresh. Thank you, Aaron Griffin, for mixing and mastering our theme song sung by Jeff Boggess. Thank you, Dalton Carney, for additional compositions, and special thanks to my co-host, Jeff Boggess, for producing and editing this episode without contributing his actual voice. You can follow the pod on Instagram at HardTicketPod, email us at hardticketpodcast@gmail.com, and give us a positive rating if you enjoyed this episode. You can follow me on Letterboxd at Tristan Moore and Instagram at Tristan__less. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming next week. Once again, thank you, folks, for your attention to this matter. You know, Star Wars means a lot to me. A new Star Wars movie just came out, and that's crazy that one just came out and no one cared. Right? Did anybody care? I don't know. I feel like I'm in a bubble maybe. Maybe it's just a bubble of cynicism, but it just definitely feels like this movie is going to come and go, and it's like, who even cares about Star Wars anymore? Damn, what a downer ending. No, like I was saying, Andor was great. Andor seasons 1 and 2 were great, and it tells me that there are still Star Wars stories that can be told that are worth telling. You know, Disney's handling of the franchise has been spotty, just as Lucas's was, in my opinion. And there's imperfect releases too that have shown promise. Like, I think The Acolyte had solid ideas. I think Skeleton Crew is a solid show for kids. I think the first season and a half of The Mandalorian are great until it gets into like a bunch of, cameos from Clone Wars and Rebels characters. So I do think that there are still going to be stories in this universe worth telling. I'm very optimistic about Star Wars Starfighter next year, even though it's directed by Sean Levi, who I don't think has directed anything of note except for Free Guy. Yeah, it doesn't really give lots of hope to fans of the saga, but Ryan Reynolds is really hot right now. He's a hot commodity, so who knows? Maybe something great will come eventually. I still have my fingers crossed for the Rian Johnson trilogy down the line, honestly. I know it's probably never going to happen, or if it does, it'll be another 10 years, but I truly think that of this past 10 years of Disney Star Wars, we'll call it the Kathleen Kennedy era, Andor will stick out. I think Visions is an underrated anthology animated series that more people need to watch, because they're just Star Wars stories that don't have any sense of continuity, so they're allowed to play with the universe in actually interesting ways. They're not beholden to a canon. And I truly think The Last Jedi will emerge as the film in the sequel trilogy that more and more people appreciate, because it does something new, and because it kind of gestured towards a more optimistic future than the future I think hinted at the end of The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker. Rogue One, I think currently is probably the most popular Disney Star Wars film. I got my problems with Rogue One. I think it's more beloved amongst older fans, and not that they're not important, but they aren't the future of the franchise. They're not the future of Star Wars. So I think Rogue One, its star will continue to burn bright. I think in part it will be helped along by Andor, because Andor will continue to be well regarded. I also think Andor really exposes the shallow character writing in Rogue One for what it is. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. I think as time goes on, Rogue One will probably be less popular, just because I think it is geared towards older fans who grew up with the original trilogy and that sort of thing. But I could be wrong. I just wanted to once again thank everybody for listening to this episode. I could talk about Star Wars for too long. Honestly, before Jeff and I started the podcast, one of the ideas that I always had in my head was doing a Star Wars podcast, or like a YouTube channel or something, and being one of those guys who analyzes Star Wars on a thematic level and character level and stuff. I don't actually think that there's a lot of demand for that. I think more people are interested in oh, tell me about this cool ship that shows up in Star Wars, and tell me about this obscure lore about this super powerful Sith Lord or whatever. Because I think that's kind of what Star Wars has become. It's just become a glorified Wikipedia thing. And that's fine. That's the core of the fan base, and it keeps it alive for better or worse. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this episode, and happy 49th to the release of the original Star Wars film. And may the Force be with you all.
It's a